Hello and welcome to another episode of Travelosophy, a podcast about life lessons learnt from travel. I'm your host, Jade Jackson. If you haven't listened to episode 1, I recommend giving it a go, as it gives a brief history on how my life became filled with travel and some of the ways that travel has influenced me. However, in this episode of Travelosophy, I wanted to bring to light some of the negative aspects of long-term travel. Don't get me wrong, I'm a positive person, and I still love to travel. But so often, all that's presented in brochures, travel literature, and Instagram is the happy side, the perfect beaches, the incredible food, the beautiful sunsets. I know comedy may talk about the mishaps, but it's rare to hear about the post-trip depression, the difficulty of long-distance relationships, and the struggle of adjusting to life back home after a year of living somewhere else, seemingly way more exciting. So today, I'm starting the discussion and bringing to light some of the cons of long-term travel. I felt compelled to record this specific podcast based on a conversation I had years ago with one of my cousins who had returned from a year of living in London and the difficulties she faced in adjusting to life back home. We're conditioned to think that, we're back home from a big trip, we should be happy, when in reality, often we'll feel the opposite. Also, after hearing about the death of Anthony Bourdain, who spent 9 months of the year on the road filming, of course, not knowing him personally, we'll never know the real reason, but whilst depression can strike anyone anywhere, it can be exasperated by the loneliness and broken relationships that follow long-term and frequent travel. If you encounter any of the negative experiences that are to follow, there's no reason to feel guilty, but simply being aware can help lead to finding a solution and can ensure you don't get to breaking point. Most importantly is to have the conversation that it's okay not to feel happy upon returning home. In no way am I dissing travel, simply bringing to light the side of travel that few people talk about, yet which I'm sure is experienced by many. If you have your own experiences you'd like to share, then please head to my website and get in touch. Ultimately though, this podcast episode will finish on a positive note and include some ideas on how to overcome the negative aspects of long-term travel. Being away from home for months or years at a time, you of course miss things like birthdays and anniversaries, perhaps even weddings. But it's the little things that people don't think of as news that you really miss out on. The seemingly insignificant events like school awards, weekend barbecues, movies people have seen, the things that are part of normal everyday conversation, but stacked up against your travels, seem somehow irrelevant and so get forgotten about. It may not seem like a big deal, but it's when those little things get forgotten, often bigger things are missed too. Like when I was living in New Zealand, I once found out my cousin was pregnant the week after she gave birth because nobody thought to mention it. Everyone just assumed that someone else had told me. Likewise, when you do move back home, expect to be on the outer initially, as obviously there's big gaps where you aren't in anyone else's lives, and they get used to you not being there. You also won't be in any of their stories. For example, maybe your family went skiing or a weekend away camping and there's photos and stories from that, but none of that includes you because you're off gallivanting around the world. Multiply this over several years and you start to realise that in the pursuit of travel, you've effectively removed yourself from people's lives. Sure, they can follow your travels on Facebook or whatnot, but when you're not there, eventually they will fill the gaps with someone else. At age 11, returning from a year of travel, the biggest difficulty I faced was school. Not because I'd missed a year of school, but because I spent a year with adults who treated me as an adult. So the whole teacher telling you to do something because they're the teacher didn't really gel with me. Most teachers hadn't lived half the life I had lived as adults, let alone me being a 12-year-old in my first year of high school. A few teachers even thought I was making it all up. Which reminds me of a story. Sorry to jump around. When I was living in Japan, my mum and sister came to visit. My sister was only 4 years old, and when she went back to preschool, the teacher wanted to have a word with my mum because she thought my sister was lying about visiting her older brother who lived in Japan and how she went to Disneyland. My mum was like, but she does have an older brother who lives in Japan, and we did go to visit him and go to Disneyland. And the teacher was like, oh, okay then. Anyway, when I was 21, I returned from a gap year spent living in London and travelling throughout Europe and North America. I came home not because I wanted to, but because I had run out of money. I specifically didn't tell anyone the day I was flying back, as I knew I'd need time to adjust. And thankfully, there was a spare key in the same spot at home. I remember walking into an empty house and thinking, This time yesterday I was in Hawaii. This time last week I was in Seattle. It was incredibly depressing. I was devastated that a year of freedom, adventure and meeting new friends was over. It also seemed insurmountable that I would travel again, made worse when I ended up back at my old job. I thought being back that I had got travel out of my system and was ready to settle down, but who was I kidding? Within 6 months I was working on a cruise ship sailing the South Pacific. Looking back, the main reason for this was because I still hadn't adjusted to life back home. Travel is often described as an itch, but in reality, it's more like feeding an addiction. Working on a cruise ship, I was home every 7 to 10 days, and so I thought this was the perfect solution, until I had my first distant Christmas. Whilst Christmas and New Year on the cruise was incredibly special, because naturally, we were all in the same boat together, away from family, but being with the same people 24/7, you build up really close relationships. And the restaurant on the ship put on a big Christmas feast, which was unique and special, but it just wasn't the same as a home-cooked dinner with the family for Christmas. Once my contract was up, I ended up getting my first job as a travel agent with STA Travel, which was great because I had access to cheap travel, and it was expected that I utilise that often in order to be better at my job. However, all this did was again make me want to travel further and longer. Eventually, I moved to Japan to teach English, which is offering a full-time salary for part-time hours. It was impossible to say no to that. A few years later, when I returned to Australia from Japan, I probably had more of a culture shock adjusting to life back in Australia than I did when I first moved to Japan. Because when you move to Japan, there's books on how to prepare for the cultural differences, and you know what they are before you go. Things like taking your shoes off when you enter a house and chopstick etiquette. But when you come back home and have to adjust to life back in Australia after living overseas, there's no books on that. Everything that I had become used to, like being able to cycle everywhere, vending machines every 100 metres, late night shopping every night, running into friends everywhere I went, and the full-time salary on part-time hours, all of that was gone. Instead, I was working 15 hours a day in a travel agency for mediocre pay. Even though eventually I found some joy in my life back in Sydney, it still took a few months being home before friends and relatives thought to invite me to places, because they'd gotten so used to me being away, they weren't used to having me back in their lives again. Now you could say all of these were my fault. It was my decision to travel, but this isn't a blame game. It's simply about bringing to light the problems that occur with long-term travel. After several gap year trips overseas, I now had an ever-growing list of friends who were scattered all around the world, which is great when I travel, as I have lots of friends to visit. And while Skype and Messenger has been a saviour, making it easy to keep in touch, it's still tough not being able to go and grab a coffee or head out to dinner with those friends because they live on the other side of the world. This only gives another excuse to travel. Oh, I've got to visit such and such in New York, or I've got to visit my friend in London, which keeps feeding the habit of travel. Once I became too old for working holiday visas, I moved to New Zealand, mainly as it was easier to get a car licence, but it was also appealing because I didn't need a visa and so could stay indefinitely. I literally booked a one-way ticket, filled out on the customs form that I lived in New Zealand now, and the customs officer was like, "Sweet as bro, welcome to New Zealand." So whilst my reasons to move to New Zealand was mainly to get a licence and partially for a better lifestyle, whilst still being close to home, there's also a certain ego boost that comes with the phrase, "I live in New Zealand," or "I live in Japan," or wherever that may be, which is also why it becomes so addictive. When you're from somewhere else, people are curious about you. They want to know more. If you're in Sydney and you mention in conversation that you live in Penrith, no one is going to say, "Oh wow, that sounds incredible, please tell me more." But if you're visiting Sydney and you mention you live in New Zealand, suddenly that opens up a barrage of questions and curiosity. In a city where your postcode dictates your place in society, the ultimate postcode is from another country. Of course, another downside to living overseas that is rarely discussed is having to set up homes in multiple countries. Before you mention, what about shipping? It's ridiculous how expensive it is. As an average, it costs double or triple what your stuff is worth to ship it. You may as well buy new stuff, which is what I did. Which means I've now set up 5 homes in as many countries, which also means the attachment to what is home becomes muddled. By that, I mean I feel at home easily. Home is wherever I am, but at the same time, it also makes it more difficult to feel at home in Australia, which is my original home, because when I'm here, I'm homesick for everywhere else. Having lived in London, Kyoto and Wellington, they're also my homes. So when I'm in Australia, I'm homesick for the coffee of Wellington, the tempura udon of Kyoto, the pork pies from Marks and Spencer's in London. But it's not just the food from places I've lived. When you travel, the world becomes your home. You build up a miss list from everywhere you've been. I miss the hot dogs from Denmark, the spring rolls from Hanoi, the amphitheatre to watch the sunset in Acapulco, the snorkeling and cheap massages of the Philippines, the solitude of Iceland. I think you get the idea. The constant craving for something that you can't have becomes a daily struggle for the traveller. You can't always easily walk down the street and buy something or go to visit someone. I mentioned food because when you're homesick, food can solve everything. After weeks of eating Chinese cuisine whilst travelling in China, I found a Pizza Hut in Chengdu, and it was glorious. You'll find a blog post about travelling China independently and a podcast about China on my website as well. Anyway, when you travel, relationships end because it's time to leave, or they become impossible to keep alive because they become long distance, which then means you find it difficult having someone around all the time because you're used to people not being there. Or maybe that's just me. You're always saying goodbye to people to the point they forget that you're even in their lives anymore. You become a distant memory, a postcard in the letterbox every few months, a voice at the end of Skype. I remember my first solo big trip overseas at 21 when everyone came out to the airport to see me off. Now I have to make my own way there, and I'm lucky if I get a bon voyage text. When you eventually return from multiple adventures, people tend to grow weary of your stories. It makes them feel boring in comparison. They become disinterested and disconnected. Their stories begin with, "Last week I went to a kid's birthday party," whilst your stories always begin in a place. "This one time I was in Phnom Penh. This one time I was in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. This one time I met Santa in the North Pole in Finland." It's not that you're trying to outdo their stories, it's just this has been your life. Even if it's directly related to the conversation at hand, some people can get quite nasty when all your stories are about somewhere else. I had one person who would constantly roll their eyes and say, "You haven't really been to Mongolia, Jade. Why are you always making stuff up?" I'm sure they only said it to wind me up, but I have no doubt other people perhaps didn't always speak what was on their mind. You also get those that feel it's competition. So whenever you mention a story from another place, they feel they have to do one better by name-dropping a celebrity. When actually, it's not a competition. It's just the life of a traveller. People think homesickness is the worst part of travel. But travel is a drug. It can take over your life, destroy relationships, take all your money. It affects your ability to maintain friendships because you're so used to people coming and going that in the end, all you're left with are your memories, your souvenirs, and your passport. Eventually, travel becomes more important than ticking off the boxes that society tells us we should, like getting married, having babies, buying houses. There becomes a sense of urgency. I must go here before it's too late. I must see this before it's passé. I must photograph this before anyone else. You convince yourself that one little trip will make things better. All you need is a little holiday, 2 weeks on a beach, getting cheap massages, eating incredible food. But it's never enough. All it does is invite you to want to travel more, travel longer, and travel further. The same arguments are used by drug addicts. Just a little hit, just this one time, and then I'm going clean. I can quit whenever I want. Unfortunately, though, there's no rehab for travel. And with air travel being cheaper than ever before, this problem is only going to get worse. When I took a year off to travel Europe and North America at 21, I was amongst the first of everyone I knew to do that. But within a few years, it was commonplace, and you were the minority if you didn't travel. In Australia, anyway. Also, the longer you travel, the more blasé about things you get. Sure, exploring a new city is always fun, but eventually, you've seen one church, you've seen them all. I've also noticed with the globalisation of retail shopping, the more places I travel to, the less they look different to home, which only makes the faraway places, the undiscovered gems, more important and yet more difficult to find. Again, like a drug, you need more adventurous travel to get the same high. Seeing the extreme poverty and slow recovery after major disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis and flooding is more confronting when you're there amongst it. I remember being in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia and seeing kids living in sewers, and in India seeing kids rummaging through trash looking for food. It's easy to forget about it when you see it on TV and can change the channel, but when you're eating dinner and a handful of kids come up to you, holding out their hand, gesturing for some food, you don't forget that. That goes home with you. In Cambodia, I had this exact scenario. So I bought dinner for a bunch of kids, which, made me feel good temporarily, but then I left, and they still have the same struggles. For years, I avoided going to India because everyone I spoke to was like, "Oh man, the poverty, it changes you, it put things into perspective." And I was like, I've seen that. I don't need to go to a country just to see poverty. Thing is, I eventually did go to India, and it did change me, but not in the way that was mentioned. What I saw was people in absolute poverty, but they still had a smile on their face. It made me think that if they can, no matter how bad it gets, then surely I can always find a reason to smile. However, the main reason I went to India was after seeing the documentary Born into Brothels, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. The idea of it is a photographer went to India, Calcutta I think, to do a photographic study of prostitutes. And she noticed a lot of them had kids who weren't in school. And when she asked why, they said because they were children of prostitutes. The government didn't want to know about them. Officially, they didn't exist, and so they couldn't get birth certificates, which meant they couldn't go to school or get jobs. Basically, these kids were condemned to a life of poverty and prostitution. They didn't speak English, but the photographer spent time with these kids, and they were curious about photography. So she taught them some English, bought them all instant cameras, and sent them out to photograph daily life. The photos they came back with were incredible, and she held an exhibition in New York, auctioned the photographs off, and raised enough money to bribe enough officials to get them all birth certificates and so they could get enrolled in school. Since then, the charity has an entire school built for other kids in the same situation to escape life on the streets, gain an education. And so primarily I was inspired to go to India to take photographs of the people, the colours, the architecture, basically what the kids had captured. But after seeing countries like India, the Philippines, Mongolia, that have deep-rooted extreme poverty, and then you go home to your menial job, back into your life of heading to the pub on a Friday night, you feel like you want to make a difference in the world, but it also seems a monumental task. But those images still haunt you. They tear you up. You feel guilty being able to walk into a fast food takeaway and order more than you need in a meal, and then upsize it for $1. When you see people going about their lives complaining about things that don't matter, like who got kicked off a reality cooking show, or what tiles a couple used in a reality renovation show, then the things you have seen seem more important, but this whole situation also feels more helpless. In Australia and America, it's incredibly frustrating seeing governments squabbling over stupid stuff, like whether politicians are Australian citizens or making poor decisions because they want themselves to look good rather than doing what is right for the people. All of these can build up, and whilst it may seem far-fetched that seeing what goes on in other countries can impact depression, when you travel, the world becomes less over there and far away and more of, in our world, a few hours away. Both negative and positive impressions can impact us when we return home. You only have to look at the popularity of volunteer tourism to see that. So how do you deal with all these downsides to travel? First and foremost, appreciate what you have at home. You can follow an upward spiral or you can follow a downward spiral, but appreciating what you have around you at home brings greater fulfillment than constantly trying to tick off boxes and find happiness elsewhere. And it's also a lot cheaper. It doesn't mean you can't travel, because part of the addiction is the journey, that feeling of going somewhere and the excitement of exploring somewhere new. But bringing it closer to home. Explore new suburbs. Take day trips, weekends away. Take a different route home. Notice the little things, a new park, a different library. Walk instead of taking public transport or driving. In Sydney, we're lucky that it's so multicultural that you can get a sense of being somewhere else, simply by going to a different suburb. You'll find a blog post on taking a micro trip on my website. But even if you're in a small town, reading books, watching movies that transport you to another place can equally help take your brain on a trip. When I was travelling in China recently, I read The Light Between Oceans, which is set on a fictional island with a lighthouse in Western Australia. I was so drawn to that island, I had a momentary shock when I looked out the window of the train and saw tiny Chinese hillside villages. On that same trip, I had rented a documentary, The Village at the End of the World, about life in a tiny village in Greenland. And again, I was so drawn into the world of Greenland. It was a mental escape from where I was. Also, don't neglect the people at home, because when you eventually return, they'll be all you have left. Of course, it's natural for friendships to change, as people's lives change with kids and marriage, but hold on to those friendships that time doesn't affect. The ones where you can sit down over lunch after a gap of 7 years and pick up where you left off. Those are the most important people you can have in your life besides family. They're the ones that will help you readjust to life back home. But it's also important to try and make new friends, which gets harder as you get older, but finding those with similar interests outside of travel like photography, art, music, writing, can further cement your roots and make you feel like you belong. I mentioned food as an antidote to homesickness, and it works the other way too. Learning to cook food from around the world can help starve off those pangs to travel. It's not going to eradicate them, but it can help in keeping them at bay. That is why exploring suburbs you may not have visited is important, because you never know what you might find in terms of restaurants. When I was in Wellington, it's difficult to find decent Middle Eastern food. And one night I drove around in the hope that I would find something. And surprisingly I did. I found a little Turkish takeaway that made pide and gözleme. If you can't physically travel, you can transport your taste buds with a mental trip. It's not a perfect solution, but it can help. As for the overcoming the negative things you've seen that stick with you when you travel, remember, you also see a lot of good in the world. The more good you see elsewhere in countries like Norway, Finland and Denmark, and how they manage to do incredible things for their people, be it welfare, transport, or the integration of refugees, gives you hope and ideas to make changes to better the world. Just because something is and has been done for years in Australia or America or anywhere, doesn't mean it can't be done better using an idea from somewhere else. When I was in New Zealand teaching travel and tourism, there was one lesson on cultural differences. And most Australians underestimate how culturally different New Zealand is compared to Australia, or even America for that matter. It focused on not just food and music, but how different cultures, including Japan, the UK and the USA, deal with things like death, respect for elders, housing and the family unit. When you put everything in a box and see the differences, it's easier to reflect and take what you like about other cultures and use it to your benefit. Likewise, just because something has always been done a specific way in one country doesn't mean it's necessarily the right way or that someone else isn't doing a better job. As an example, in Asia, the family unit is much closer. It's common to have multiple generations living in the same house. But in Australia, as soon as someone is too old, they're shipped off to a nursing home and forgotten about, usually. It's culturally unacceptable in Australia to have an elderly relative living in the same house as their children. Yet in Japan, it's the opposite. Likewise with housing. In Australia, it's seen as a mark of a lifetime achievement to own a house with a backyard, and if you don't have that, it's seen as a failure. But as the cost of housing becomes less affordable in Australia, where does that leave that mark of achievement? And we should be asking, is it really such an achievement? I mean, can we take a house with us when we die? There's no current viable alternative, so looking at what other countries have done could provide a solution. Like in New Orleans, where many houses were made unlivable after Hurricane Katrina and had to be demolished, alternative housing options were tested, some with positive results. Likewise, after the tsunami in Banda Aceh in Indonesia, new green housing projects have been utilised that are both better for the environment and more sustainable. These are extreme examples and certainly more long-term, but the point I'm trying to make is things can change for the better. It may be frustrating, but you can help implement positive change to make home more like the places you've travelled to. So in other words, the more people travel and learn and understand how things could be done better based on experiences elsewhere, the better things can be at home. So as commercial space travel becomes within the realm of possibility, visiting 50 or 100 countries becomes meaningless. Soon it will be, how many planets have you been to? The problems with long-term travel are only going to continue, so it's important to recognise those and have plans in place to deal with them ahead of time. With broken relationships, the potential of being forgotten and losing a sense of what home is, it's crazy to think that travel could be so addictive. But just like any drug, the cons are ignored whilst the pros are glorified. So next time you embark on a long journey, or perhaps you're already on one, remember there's a side of travel that is less talked about, what you won't see on Instagram, and that is the lonely side, the constant longing for something and somewhere else, the dissatisfaction with being home, while simultaneously feeling at home around the world. Don't forget about the people at home. Ask about the small things. And whilst it may seem like lifestyles are better elsewhere, whatever problems you have at home will easily follow you on your travels. So if you want a solution to your problems, first you must look inside yourself. If you're desperate for a travel hit, take a micro trip. Indulge in some foreign food, watch a movie, set in a different country to help appease your desires. I can't say I won't head off again, but at least I can say now, I know life is what you make of it, not just where you go. Although a really interesting twist to all of this is I recently read an article about a specific gene D4DR-2/7R, which was found in people that were known to be nomadic and often on the move. Those that had this gene were both healthier and happier when they did move around, and they had an unquenching desire to continuously go somewhere. So perhaps it's not an addiction after all. Maybe it really is in your genes. Thanks for listening to this slightly rambling episode of Travelosophy. If you have your own experiences or life lessons to share, then you can tweet me at jdickensjackson. You can check out my travel photos on Instagram at jdickensjackson. You can read my travel blog on my website, jadejackson.com.au. And of course, if you loved it, please feel free to leave a review, tell your friends, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes. If you'd like to support the podcast, then head to the Support the Podcast page on my website. There's some really easy ways you can support the podcast without it costing you any extra. For example, if you buy books and you click on the book depository link on my website, then any purchase you make earns me a small commission without any additional cost to you. Likewise, if you see links for hotels or iTunes, then these all contribute a small commission for any purchases made. And if you absolutely love what you hear and want even more of it, including exclusive content, then head to my Patreon page, which is www.patreon.com/JadeJackson, where you can join the Travelosophy community and have access to personal and exclusive content like additional podcast episodes, ad-free blog posts, and MP3 recordings of my poetry. Thank you so much for listening to Travelosophy with Jade Jackson. Ciao.